science link today in our ELA book. It's about El Niño. It's a climate. I don't want to say climate change because it's different than that. It's a climate phenomena that happens when there's warm water in the Pacific, and with climate change, if there's more warm water, we might get a permanent El Niño, which would not be good. So we'll see what happens. And so El Niño is just when warm water in the Pacific gets too warm, it causes a lot of storms in different parts of the world in different weather. Kind of changes the weather. And this happened before climate change. It was a climate phenomena that happened. But now, if the water always stays warm like that, maybe this could cause massive climate change. Our Earth and climate is a little more sensitive than some people think. Scientists are finding that out. All right, so let's read about El Niño. Funny thing, El Niño actually means the child, or in this instance, the Christ child in Spanish. They named it after that for some reason. But El Niño now means that climate phenomena of warm weather in the Pacific, warm water, I should say. El Niño by Fred Pierce. In the winter of 1998, heavy rains caused mudslides in California that washed houses off cliffs. Ice storms on the eastern seaboard from Maine to Quebec downed so many power lines that thousands of people had to live in the dark and cold for weeks. Indonesia's rainforest got no rain, and the months of dry weather turned the forest into the world's largest pile of firewood. At the same time, the worst drought in 100 years hit neighboring New Guinea, killing crops and leaving some of the most isolated people on Earth starving. On the other side of the globe, lack of rain left the water level in the Panama Canal so low that large ships couldn't make it through. There's a picture of some mudslides. Ooh. Early 1998 also saw intense storms in places not used to them. Kenya suffered the worst floods in 40 years. In the middle of the dry season, neighboring Uganda was cut off for several days, when both road and rail links were washed away. In South America, floods made 500,000 Peruvians homeless along a coastline that often has no rain for years at a time. Neighboring Ecuador said it would take 10 years to repair the damage. In the northern Tibet, the worst snow in 50 years, starved or froze to death hundreds of Mongol tribesmen. Was it just bad luck that there was so much bad weather in so many parts of the world around the same time? 50 years ago, most people would have said yes. But today, meteorologists, scientists who study weather blame most of 1998's weather disasters on a giant blip in the weather system called El Niño. Many years ago, Spanish-speaking Peruvian fishermen noticed that the fish suddenly disappeared whenever warm waters flowed in from the west. They called the warming El Niño, Spanish for the child, because it usually happened around Christmas. El Niño is caused by a sudden shift in the winds and ocean currents in the Pacific Ocean that pushes a layer of warm water across the ocean, taking weather systems with it. El Niño is rather like a wave in your bathtub, only the tub is huge, and the wave takes months to go from one end to the other. The huge bathtub in this case is the Pacific, the world's largest ocean. Most of the time, winds and ocean currents at the equator move from east to west across the Pacific, from the Americas to Asia. The winds and currents push the ocean's water toward Asia. After a few years of this, the sea level around the islands of Indonesia is actually over a foot higher than on the American side. This can't go on forever, and it doesn't. Eventually, like a wave reaching the far end of your bathtub, the water bounces back, moving towards the America. Scientists have clocked this wave moving about 125 miles a day. The water around Indonesia is the hottest in the world, usually warmer than 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is as warm as many swimming pools. As the wave moves towards the Americas, it spreads a layer of the warm Indonesian water across the ocean. And because ocean currents and winds are connected, the Indonesian weather follows too. This means that heavy rains that normally hit Indonesia for most of the year get moved thousands of miles east, soaking the Pacific Islands and normally dry coast from Peru to California. Meanwhile, normally wet Indonesia and its surrounding areas suffer drought. No one is really sure how long El Niño has been around. Dan Sandweiss of the University of Maine has found telltale signs of sudden El Niño-style floods in old sediments in Peru. Sediments are the solid stuff that settles out of water at places like the mouth of a river. When it doesn't rain, few plants grow and there isn't much pollen in the sediments. But when El Niño occurs in these normally dry regions, more plants grow and more pollen shows up. From the amount of pollen in the sediments, Sandweiss can tell that El Niño has been around for at least 5,000 years. Before that, there seems to have been a gap. El Niño isn't just about some rainstorm in California in 1998. It's about wild weather around the world through recorded history. Episode 2. I think you turned when you shouldn't have. La Niña strikes back. El Niño typically lasts some 18 months and usually returns every 3 to 7 years. Probably when enough warm water is built up against the western Pacific. But when El Niño's warm water retreats, it's sometimes followed by a cool water wave. Scientists call this cooling of the Pacific La Niña. La Niña's effect on the weather is harder to predict than El Niño's. But during La Niña years, the normal weather in some regions becomes exaggerated. It gets extra wet in wet Indonesia, extra dry in dry Peru. That's also when we get big droughts in the American Midwest. The Great Dust Bowl drought of the 1930s America is thought to have been caused by a decade of La Niña-like conditions. All right. So thank you, and we'll start writing the big open response tomorrow, okay? All right, bye. Have a good one.